Hi, I'm Dr. Sridhar Kalyanasundram, consultant neonatologist. Welcome to my channel. In this video, I'll be looking at a simple overview of assessment and examination of the neonate. So we will review the risk factors at the time of delivery. That's part of the assessment. We will look at the group B streptococcus screening result. All of you should be familiar with the protocol that you use in your unit. You may be using the Royal College protocol, you may be using the American Academy protocol, or you may be using the early onset sepsis screen score. We have the antenatal and maternal screening results. So this will be the various tests, the infection screen like hepatitis B, HIV, VDRL, and so on, as well as the diabetes status, the scan results which show any concerns, and the growth status including the flow during the later periods, especially in a growth restricted baby. So early onset sepsis score calculator, there is a video on my channel. I will refer you to that. This is based on the group B streptococcal infection risk as well as results based and the clinical condition of the baby. There are also risk factors for blood glucose monitoring. I will be mentioning that briefly, but again there is a video on hypoglycemia where this is discussed in detail. Risk factors for jaundice, blood group incompatibility setting, family history, and so on. Again, I refer you to both the lecture on neonatal jaundice as well as the use of the Billy tool, which is there on the channel as well. Any other factors that would warrant close monitoring should be looked at as well. So family history of sudden deaths or any other concerns, any suspicion of inborn error of metabolism, and so on. The initial examination of the baby is done soon after delivery by the nurse, midwife, or the doctor attending the delivery, depending on the situation in your hospital. The postnatal full examination should be done by the pediatrician at least once prior to discharge home. This should be a head-to-toe assessment, which we'll be discussing. So when we talk of head-to-toe systemic examination, we look at the head, face, mouth, ears, and all the structures, the digits of the baby, the extremities in close detail, cardiovascular system assessment including the femoral pulses, the presence or absence of murmur, respiratory system from point of view of respiratory distress, symmetry of air entry, and so on. Examination of the abdomen for shape, any absence of hernia, and we have to look for the organomegaly as well. Examination of the central nervous system, including the measurement of the head circumference, the tone of the baby, reflexes, including the primitive reflexes that are there in the newborn period. We also look at the eyes, which is the red reflex, and presence of subconjunctival hemorrhage or other concerns. Hip examination as well. So the skin is the first organ we look at, and parents are often anxious about cutaneous findings. I refer you to my video on skin rash in newborns, and this will just be a quick overview. So we get findings like mottling on the skin, which is called cutis marmorata, erythema toxicum, erythematous blotchy rash with papules in the middle, which is very common, benign. Milia, which is white, purely white, small papules and vesicles, and which are benign, usually happen on the chin, nose, and so on. It usually stays for 3 weeks or so. And miliaria, which is prickly heat due to overwrapping the baby. Mongolian spots, which are very common in the dark skin races, especially in this location. It can be there in the extremities as well. All these are benign, do not need any intervention. Another common concern when we look at the head of the baby is presence of caput and cephalhematoma. So we have the layers of the scalp starting from the skin. If there is a collection under the skin because of the position of the head or the use of vacuum, it's usually caput, and that is serosanguinous liquid which seeps out of the vessels due to the pressure around delivery. We have the periosteum, which is the covering of the bone, and if there is a bleed under the bone covering and over the surface of the bone, it's limited by the periosteum to that bone surface. This is called a cephalhematoma. The cephalhematoma typically happens even after non-traumatic deliveries, may be an effect of the negative pressure during the descent of the head. It can happen in traumatic deliveries and with vacuum extraction as well. You can see it rising after the first 12 to 24 hours. It's usually not present at birth. The blood accumulates. It's limited by the periosteum, which is a tense membrane, so it doesn't keep expanding. And the typical thing about the cephalhematoma is that it can grow for 2 to 3 days, but very rare for the baby to become anemic from it. The blood breakdown may lead to increased risk of jaundice, and what we need to mainly tell the parents is to avoid excessive pressure or forceful massage over that area, because sometimes it can expand. Even after 1 to 2 weeks, I've seen some babies where the cephalhematoma expands. And we also have to tell them that it takes time to resolve. It slowly organizes itself around the edges. It may feel firm, and in the center it feels continues to feel boggy, and then it becomes firm, a small nodule-like thing after the blood clot organizes. The subgaleal hematoma happens between the galea aponeurotica and the muscle layer, and because it's a loose space which is not limited, it can spread widely. So it's very important that we consider the subgaleal hematoma in any traumatic delivery where there is a loose scalp tissue, where it looks boggy, and on turning the baby to one side, it may run to the side which is dependent. This because the blood can flow within this loose chamber. Because it's a large area and sometimes an artery-like vessel is involved, it can bleed excessively. Baby can become hypovolemic and go into shock. So it's very important to recognize this quickly. Regular measurement of the head circumference, close monitoring of the vital signs, and observation of these signs, measurement of the hemoglobin, these will guide you. The eyes of the newborn are often congested, the same with the nose, because if you are coming by vaginal delivery, the head has been descending down. It also faces the congestion due to compression during the labor process. So this congestion leads to stickiness of the eyes in the first 2-3 days. Unless there is a pus-like discharge which keeps persisting, you don't need antibiotic drops for it. You can clean it and observe. After the first few days, when the baby starts producing tears, by end of 10 to 14 days, you may start seeing tearing there because the nasolacrimal duct may not be fully open. In those cases, you massage in the inner punctum pressure which is placed there, and use pressure up and down a few times a day. This takes time to resolve. If it's a blocked nasolacrimal duct, it's often partial, so you see a little mucus congestion in the corner of the eyes in babies. When you look at the head and assessment of the face of the baby, you look for dysmorphism. Cleft lip and palate usually are very striking, but the cleft palate can be missed sometimes unless you look carefully. If it's a posterior cleft or a cleft of the soft palate, you may need to use a tongue depressor. It's a good idea to feel with your hand as well, so you don't miss it and it doesn't lead to medico-legal problems. The cleft lip and cleft palate, you need a special team to assess and support the feeding. You may need a special type of bottle like Haberman bottle. So this is one of the main things. Any other form of dysmorphism, seek your senior colleagues' advice, because if you tell something to the family and they get upset, it can escalate problems. It may lead to unnecessary anxiety. So don't name syndromes, or don't mention that the baby is looking abnormal. Also look at both parents and other family members. One good way to ask the parents whether the baby resembles anyone in the family. So sometimes it's a familial slight feature difference. Coming to cord care, we don't routinely recommend use of alcohol wipes, and avoid covering the cord with a nappy. Fold the nappy below the cord so it doesn't encourage the growth of anaerobes, which will lead to smell and also stickiness. Colonization with the aerobe supports drying and separation, so use of antibiotic powders and creams are not recommended, as it will delay the separation by delaying the colonization with these bacteria. When it is starting to separate, you clean that with wet cotton, and air drying is adequate, keeping the nappy below it. Red reflex is a very important part of the assessment, and many of us may not be doing it routinely. If you are not doing it routinely, please start incorporating it. It only needs an ophthalmoscope, and it's fairly simple to learn. So you keep the ophthalmoscope next to your eyes and look into the baby's eyes. This doctor is holding the baby up, but you can also keep the baby on the crib or request someone else. So you may need to separate the eyelids When the baby is quiet, you can separate the eyelids and see the red reflex quite easily. So in an awake baby, again, be very gentle. Do the red reflex at the start before the baby starts crying. Because once a baby starts crying, the eyelids are screwed in and you cannot really open it to see the red reflex well. If the baby doesn't open the eyes well, you can hold like this and rock the baby back and forth when they open slightly. As long as you're focused on the pupils, it's just a quick glance which tells you that the light pathway through the eyes to the choroid, which is the red pink color you see in the back, is normal. So the retina is transparent, so the choroid vessels will reflect through that, and that's what we are seeing. And this is a normal red reflex, and you may have a paler red reflex or a very bright red reflex depending on the skin complexion. The fairer skin races have a very bright red reflex, and the pale skin ones or dark skin ones will have a pale fundus. Sometimes it's difficult to assess whether it is a pale fundus or whether it's a failed reflex. So you wait for the baby to move, or you turn the baby head to the side. You see the blood vessels streaking past, then it's just a pale fundus. You also have subconjunctival hemorrhage, which is fairly common, which is a source of anxiety for the parents. Usually resolves within a few days to weeks. You don't need to routinely examine the eyes inside by the ophthalmoscope and the ophthalmology review, because even if it's a very small retinal hemorrhage due to the delivery, it usually resolves on its own. But where you have a doubt about the red reflex, you should always review with the ophthalmologist, who can do the slit lamp and other assessments to look for the reason for it. As I mentioned about the eyes, the nasal congestion is also common. The baby may have noisy breathing, which clears with saline drops. Very rarely you may need suction. Where there is a persistent block, you consider choanal atresia. This can be unilateral, in which case you may not pick it up in the newborn period. Bilateral choanal atresia is not common. It's 1 in 30,000 or so. But it can be a serious condition, as when the baby closes the mouth, the cyanosis sets in. When the baby is crying, the color becomes normal. So this is a clue, and you may consider a CT scan. This is one indication where we don't resist CT scan, because if it's a bony choanal atresia, only the CT scan will pick it up better than the MRI. Examination of the cardiovascular system, you have to listen for the heart sounds, the heart rate, the peripheral pulses, and the capillary filling. You listen for murmur as well if it is there. Many babies have a transient murmur due to the PDA closing or a transient tricuspid regurgitation. It usually settles down, and you can reassess if the baby is clinically well. The saturation is normal. You can review the baby the following day. If the murmur persists, you can refer to the cardiologist. It's important to feel the femoral pulses bilaterally, but remember that feeling the pulse in the first 24-48 hours doesn't rule out coarctation of the aorta, because the PDA is open and it may be bringing the blood to the lower limb as well. So it's always important to remember that you need to reassess the baby, and somewhere along this, the critical heart disease screen may bring up a lowish saturation by 24 hours in some of these babies. So the critical heart disease screen, there are detailed videos on my channel and you can review those. The oxygen saturation is monitored close to 24 hours. Earlier, if you're discharged early, you do it typically in the right hand, which is a preductal saturation, and on either foot, which is a postductal. Baby should be awake but not struggling and have regular breathing. Take the record for at least 2 minutes. It's mainly aimed at critical heart disease, the hypoplastic left heart, tricuspid or pulmonary atresia, tetralogy of Fallot, transposition, and TAPVC. So the child is in a well baby nursery more than or equal to 24 hours of age, or shortly before discharge. If less than 24 hours, you screen the baby. If it is less than 90% in the right hand or foot, it's a positive screen or a failed test. If it is 90 to 95, or the difference is more than 3%, you repeat in 1 hour, and you can repeat that twice, even though the recent update suggests that the second repeat may not be necessary. And you can go to the third part, which is a pass test more than 95% and less than 3% difference. So moving on to what would you do if there is a failed test? I mean, obviously you have to evaluate clinically. If it's a respiratory condition causing the saturation to be low, you manage appropriately. If there is a murmur or you don't find any other reason, call the cardiologist to do a scan before the baby can be discharged or managed as necessary. Respiratory system, I mean, it's a little more straightforward. Like if there is no respiratory distress, you assess the air entry, respiratory rate, and For the abdomen, you palpate for organomegaly. The hernia is very unusual in the immediate newborn period. In a premature baby just before discharge, it's likely to come up, so please watch the hernial orifices in these babies. It's very important not to miss undescended testes, because this is another source of anxiety, as well as medico-legal complaints come up if the doctor has missed it in the initial assessment. In a female baby, virilization may lead to ambiguous genitalia, and in a male baby, micropenis has to be considered if there is hypoglycemia. Especially, you have to look at a stretched penis length less than 2.5 centimeters, which is micropenis. So undescended testes can be in any of these locations. It can be abdominal in 15%. You should remember that sometimes there is a vanishing testis due to a vascular insult. The testis has disappeared, so you may not have a testis. It can be in the inguinal canal in the 25% or a high scrotal in 60%. So in these two categories, you can either feel it or it can be seen on the ultrasound, which reassures. There is no need to routinely do ultrasound, but if parents are very anxious, there is no harm in documenting that you've seen the testis, which means it's not an absent testis, and then you refer them to the pediatric surgeon by 6 months to 9 months if it is still not descended. This is the spectrum of virilization. As you can see, this is a normal female and the normal male, and if it starts going in this line from the male, it becomes under-virilized male, and if it starts going towards the right from the female, it becomes over-virilized female, usually congenital adrenal hyperplasia or other factors. The under-virilized male may lead to hypospadias and micropenis. The next aspect is the hip assessment, which is very important as well, and we can refer for hip ultrasound if there is breech presentation. Female baby is more at risk. Family history where the first degree relative has a risk of developmental dysplasia, or we have an abnormal clinical examination by the Barlow's or Ortolani test. So it's very easy to remember, like Barlow dislocates and Ortolani reduces. So you can see here that we adduct the hip and push back. So the hip, which is already in line, comes out. This is Barlow's test. And once it's dislocated, if you abduct the hip and push forward at the ischial trochanter area, the greater trochanter area goes in. And this is Ortolani reduces. So remember that both these tests can be painful to the baby, and don't keep repeating it, as if it is a dislocatable joint, it can damage the labia of the acetabulum. So some countries do routine screening ultrasounds for all babies, like Germany and the Scandinavian countries. Most of the other countries do risk factor based on this approach. However, remember that not having the dislocation at birth or not having a clicky hip at birth doesn't rule out the problem. So it's important to see the hip assessment for the first few months. So keep that in the background. Monitoring the vital signs, each of our units may have different policies, but it's very important in the first 4 hours that we are monitoring very closely. After the first 4 hours, some units do it every 4 hours till discharge. Some units go down to 4 hourly for the first 12 hours and then 6 hourly till discharge. But some form of regular monitoring is needed, and the parent should be clearly instructed that you have to inform the nurse if there is any concern. When the nurse is assessing the vital signs, they can plot it on the newborn early warning score, which is a conglomeration of findings like temperature, respiratory rate, presence or absence of grunting, heart rate, color, and neurological response. And according to the range at which comes in, you can score as normal, amber, or red. The more the number of amber signs, the more significant it is, but any red sign is very significant and needs immediate assessment. So if there is one amber observation, you need to repeat the observations in 30 minutes, but inform the doctor or midwife and look for factors that may improve it yourself depending on which aspect of it is abnormal. For example, if the temperature is coming on the cooler side, you look at the room temperature, you look at the wrapping. If the baby is warm, you can again look at the room temperature, look at risk factors closely, and so on. If there is 2 amber or 1 red, immediate review by the pediatrician is necessary. A quick mention of the hypoglycemia risk factors. Normal newborn should not have blood sugar checked because they have the postnatal nadir. If you check the sugar and find it low, you will unnecessarily intervene. That's why we screen based on the risk factors, and the risk factors are based on the inability of the babies to cope with the hypoglycemia, either because they have no stores to respond to the hormones which stimulate, or they have picture of hyperinsulinism, where there is resistance to using these stores. So we have large for gestational age or small for gestational age babies, infant of diabetic mother, mother on beta blockers, premature babies, and symptomatic babies of any type are at risk as well. Neonatal jaundice is very important. Most units now have the transcutaneous bilirubinometer, so don't go by your visual assessment of jaundice. You have to identify the risk factors for jaundice as well. If the mother is Rh negative, mom is O positive, with the baby being AB or ABU, which is ABO setting, you have a positive direct antigen test, which is a Coombs test. You have bruising or cephalometoma, which increases the risk of jaundice. Term babies less than 39 weeks, so 37 and 38 weekers, and the late premature babies are at risk as well. And if you have risk factors for early onset sepsis, there is a higher risk of jaundice as well. So it's a very common problem, and you have to monitor it before you consider discharge, and also when you plan the follow-up. You have to have clear-cut guidelines. I mentioned the CDC guidelines and the use of the Billy tool. I refer you to my video on that topic to review. A couple of slides about common antenatal problems and approach. If there is antenatal hydronephrosis, you review the antenatal scan findings on whether it is unilateral or bilateral and the size of the pelvis. So bilateral moderate hydronephrosis in a male baby, you need to rule out posterior urethral valve. So look for the PE of the baby and consider early scan if there is any concern. If the baby is passing urine well with a good stream and it is a unilateral hydronephrosis or a female baby, you can do the scan at 3 to 5 days of age. We should avoid in the first 48 hours, as the relative dehydration and the fluid balance change may underestimate the findings. When there is a history of maternal hypothyroidism, it's very common to get hypothyroidism these days. The gestational diabetes and hypothyroidism are seen in almost 1 in 4 pregnancies these days. So check the history of previous hyperthyroidism, and if simple hypothyroid in the mother, sending the newborn screen and considering the thyroid function. If the newborn screen abnormal or if there is other concerns like prolonged jaundice should be adequate. If there is a previous history of Graves' disease but it has been treated, there is still a risk of the antibodies being there in the mother and causing problems in the baby. So do the thyroid function on day 2 to 3, and remember that there is a TSH surge in the first 2 days which can